So I've been ordained a priest now for about 21 months, and I arrived here at Ascension on July 1st, 2017. And the first weekend that I was here, I had the opportunity to preach at all the masses that weekend. And I introduced myself and talked a little bit about my background, about my education prior to entering seminary. I talked a little bit about my life experiences and some of the work that I had done in the private sector. And then about, 3 or 4 months later, I happened to be talking to a gentleman back in the gathering space, and he was telling me that he was at the mass, one of the masses that weekend, and that he enjoyed hearing me preach and enjoyed hearing about my story. And he asked me, "So, Father, when did you decide to be a priest?" And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, "Today." And he said, kind of chuckled. He said, "No, really, when did you decide to be a priest?" And I said, "Today, this morning." Because it's true. Every day, I have a choice whether or not to say yes to my priestly vocation. Now, when I chose to enter seminary and leave the life that I knew behind, that certainly was a significant yes. And then I gave an even bigger, more definitive yes on the day of my ordination. But since that day, and every day, really, I have made very small little yeses along the way. Every day I have a choice to say yes to Christ and to deepen my commitment to Him as one of His priests. Now, this fifth Sunday of Ordinary Time, we celebrate World Marriage Day. Now, as a priest, I received the Sacrament of Holy Orders on the day of my ordination. For those of you who are married, on your wedding day, you receive the Sacrament of Holy Matrimony. Now, believe it or not, Holy Matrimony and Holy Orders have a lot in common, at least more in common than one might think. Priesthood, consecrated religious life, and married life, they're all vocations. They are all calls by God to make a self-gift, to give the gift of oneself to another, to give love and to receive love in return. In the case of priesthood and religious life, we make a gift of ourselves for the good of the broader church. Married couples give the gift of themselves for the good of their spouse, of one another. And so just like priests and religious, married couples have to decide every day whether or not to say yes to their God-given vocation. And for those of you who are married, you know this to be true, don't you? Every day when you wake up in the morning, every day when your feet hit the floor, to one degree or another, you decide on the level of commitment you're going to make for that day to your vocation. And some days it's easy, and some days it's not so easy. It requires grace, that supernatural help that comes from God, that cooperation between divine gift and human response, to be able to give yourself to your spouse in a way that is free, faithful, total, and fruitful. Because you see, we don't have church weddings here at Ascension. Would you believe me if I told you that? We don't simply have church weddings here. But what we do is we celebrate the sacrament of holy matrimony with couples. And in the sacrament of holy matrimony, one man and one woman enter into a covenant with one another. It's not just a commercial transaction, but the one spouse says to the other, "I give my full self to you. I give my whole person to you, completely, totally, irrevocably, for your good, and you do the same for me." Through the sacrament of holy matrimony, couples receive grace to help them live out their married lives. In our first reading today from Isaiah, the prophet hears the voice of God calling out to him, and he replies, "Here I am, send me." Friends, God calls all of us to respond to His grace, and He asks us to bring forth His love to others. The vocation of marriage is just that, a manifestation of God's love, both in the sense of husbands and wives witnessing to one another and to any children that might come forth from that love, and to the rest of the world. In our second reading today, St. Paul reminds the Corinthians that he was sent by God to preach the gospel. But preaching the gospel wasn't reserved just for St. Paul or for the other apostles or for priests who get up and preach on Sunday. The fact is that all of us are called to preach the gospel, to give witness to Christ in whatever God-given vocation we have been given. Those who are called to married life preach the gospel by living lives of dedication and faithfulness to their spouse. They are called to love, to serve, to witness, and to make sacrifice. When a husband or wife cooks dinner, or cleans the house, or does laundry, or takes care of the other when he or she is sick, these are small little acts of love and kindness that hopefully do not go overlooked, that hopefully are not taken for granted. Of course, words like thank you, I love you, I'm sorry, should be phrases that are exchanged between married couples on a regular basis. And they're very simple. Thank you, I love you, I'm sorry. Very important. In our gospel today, Jesus gets into Peter's boat and starts giving orders. He says, put out into deep water and lower your nets for a catch. And this is really a bold move on Jesus' part for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a fisherman, Peter's boat would have been his livelihood. He was the professional fisherman between the two of them, not Jesus. And so normally you wouldn't just climb into someone's boat and start giving directions. But this is exactly what Jesus does. He climbs into Jesus' boat and he says, okay, do this, do that, go here, go there. The second thing that I think is fascinating is that the optimal time to catch fish would have been at nighttime in the dark when the fish would not be able to see the nets in the water. Also, not into the deep as Jesus commands, but actually fishermen would expect to catch fish closer to the shore where the food supply is more plentiful for fish. And so to summarize, the optimal time and place for Peter and his crew to catch fish would have been at night when it was dark, closer to the shore, not out into the deep. And Jesus tells Peter to do the exact opposite, to go into the deep when there's light outside. Now, Peter could have shrugged all of this off. He could have completely disobeyed Christ's orders, but he doesn't. He says, well, okay, you're the boss, and he does exactly what Jesus tells him to do. He chooses to believe that Jesus' words are meaningful and to be followed, and as a result, Peter and his crew catch an abundance of fish. Peter's faith is rewarded. And that, I think, is one of the main takeaways for us in this gospel that we read today. Peter's faith is rewarded. Now, married couples run into times that are stressful, that are frustrating and difficult. Whether it's paying bills or stress at work or raising children, getting through difficult and trying times is tough, and it requires faith. And so, just as he did with Peter, Jesus is inviting us, and especially married couples today, to put our faith in him, especially when things don't seem to make sense, just like it didn't in the case of Peter that we read about in our gospel today. Jesus called Peter and the other apostles to share in his mission, the mission of the church. As baptized persons, we are all called to take part in the mission as well. We all have a special and unique role in the mission, and that's our vocation, our calling to self-gift. And so if you want to know when it was I decided to be a priest, today, this morning. Now, we may never know fully or understand why we are where we are now in our own vocational journey, whether it's married, single, priest, or religious. Only God knows the depths of his own wisdom. But we can respond, and we can recommit ourselves every day to our God-given vocation, whatever it may be. The choice is really up to us.